Hey gang, I'm on the Fox River just south of St. Charles, not far from where the body of Marilla Churchill was discovered on the bank of the river, buried. Let me start off by saying if you haven't watched part 1 and part 2, I'll put the link up here, go back and watch, otherwise none of this is going to make sense. The story needs to be put into context of the overall story. This is part 3 of the trilogy, and the first thing we're going to do right now is we're going to go see the real Lovell's Tavern. We discovered it. It wasn't the other building, that other mansion. It's a smaller house, and we get an up-close view of what it looks like outside. Did not go inside. There's someone that lives there, and I will just say we're not going inside, and we'll leave it at that. Still standing. It's an all-brick structure, and it's in pretty good shape. It's not a large house. It's not very large at all, and it is well, I don't know that it's in great shape, but the bricks probably need some tuck pointing. It's definitely showing its age. And if you look up near the top and you look at the windows, you can see some of the limestone. It looks like limestone lintels. And this is definitely 1800s. And remember, this was probably built in 1840s, I'm going to say. And we'll just take a quick pass here. And just imagine, right in those windows, right there is the dining room. And just imagine that's where the three boys, I should say, were eating their dinner. And it's where Emaline, the daughter of James Lovell, overheard their scheming. This all looks original here. I don't know if any of this is original. Could be. You know what? This could have been the stables. This right here could have been the stables. Because everything was horses. I'm betting that is original. Okay, welcome back. Now let's talk about Marilla and the family. Working with Marilla Churchill, the descendant, and also a Dr. Rodney Nelson, who's the authority in the town of St. Charles, who provided a manuscript on this story that I'm going to put in the link in the description box below. Just scroll down. There are some incredible new parts to this story, and one of which is her father died in 1854, just 5 years later, in a horrible way. There was a ship called the Star of the West that was launched in 1852, and it did several years of service, civilian, passenger, steamship. But at the start of the Civil War, the Union purchased the ship, or they consigned it to move Union soldiers and ammunition around. This ship was fired upon by the Confederates at the Citadel near Fort Sumter. And I don't know if it was hit or not, but it was said to be the first shots there at Fort Sumter, part of that initiation of the start of the Civil War. Now, going back further in time, the ship was eventually scuttled by the Confederates, but going back to when it had its passenger days 5 years after, in 1854, it was doing missions to the San Francisco goldfields, and it was David Churchill who was on the ship, along with many others looking for their fortune. But sadly, it was a gale that came up as they were ferrying the people back from shore onto the ship. They should have waited, but as they were doing so, during this gale, David Churchill lost his life with many others in a disaster. What we're going to do is I'm going to narrate the story right now with a lot of pictures, and here we go. I'm going to read to you this tragic story as it was written in the Hartford Courant newspaper from Hartford, Connecticut, back on March 15th in 1854. The headlines read, "Arrival of the Star of the West. $913,611 in gold on board. 24 returned Californians drowned." The Star of the West, Captain Tinklepaw from San Juan, arrived at New York about midnight on Monday with 410 passengers and all of that money in gold on freight. She brings the particulars of the drowning of 24 returned Californians in Virgin Bay by the upsetting of a boat on the 25th. This catastrophe happened while the passengers were leaving the shore for the steamer. They were steerage passengers and left San Francisco on the 16th of February in the Brother Jonathan. On the 1st of March, the steamer anchored in the harbor of San Juan del Sud. The transit across the country to Virgin Bay occupied 2 hours. Here, 2 steamers, the Central America and the Amtempe, were in waiting for their passengers. The former sailed, but the wind soon after swept a perfect tempest across the lake, and the Amtempe was forced to take refuge under the lee side of the mountains opposite the village during the night. The next morning she again made her appearance and anchored some 300 or 400 yards from the pier. We copy from a long account furnished to the New York papers by one of the passengers here. The sea was exceedingly rough, and the surf rolled up upon the beach with tremendous fury. The steamer had lost her boat, and some time elapsed before it was recovered, after which much difficulty was experienced in getting a line to the shore. But this accomplished the process of embarkation. This was effected by means of a large air-chambered iron launch, capable of containing comfortably 50 to 60 people. 3 loads with great care were successfully landed on board, and after that, upon loading the 4th time, the man having the boat in charge exhibited great impatience, provoked no doubt by the obstinacy he had encountered the previous night, and fearing he would be unable to finish his work while the daylight hours lasted. Persisted, he did, on crowding her more than prudence and sound judgment could justify, and she was pushed from the pier with more than 80 persons on board. As she slowly proceeded, it became apparent to all on shore that she was in extreme peril, and her progress was watched with painful anxiety. As wave after wave struck her, she was seen to sink lower in the water, until at length, when about 100 yards distance, the whole column of heavy sea rolled over her entire length, filling her to the gunwales. A scream of horror ensued which beggars all description. Cries of terror simultaneously arose from the launches and the hundreds of spectators upon the steamer and on shore. The sea was instantly covered with floating objects, among which were distinguished many human forms that had been washed from the boat or had been thrown themselves overboard in the first moment of the alarm. Some were battling manually with the waves, others yielding themselves at once to despair. They were sinking without any apparent effort at safety, their hands as if in supplication raised above their heads, while in the midst of all was the launch, still half filled with human beings, clinging with almost hopeless agony to each other. The crowd looked upon the steamer unable to render assistance, they looked on with horror. The people on shore were less constrained. The natives were the first to discover the full extent of the danger and render efficient aid. With one wild shriek and an impulse, they would have done credit to the best of mankind. They tore off their scanty garments and rushed to the relief of the sufferers, the woman being the first in the benevolent and dangerous work. A dozen native women rushed at large bungo that laid high and dry upon the beach, and dragging it to the waves, pushed it with almost incredible speed through the water towards the launch. As they approached this one of the women sprang forward, tearing a half-dead child from the arms of its drowning mother, held it with one hand above her head, and swam with their precious charge to the shore. Others succeeded in saving the mother. Other cases of like character occurred. One native man lost his life in his generous efforts to save the others. In less than an hour after the disaster occurred, 16 dead bodies were upon the beach, some dragged ashore by the natives, others washed in with the surf. Several others were subsequently found, and about a half a dozen more were known to be missing. 51 of those in the launch were saved. The first body recovered was that of a woman, upon whose clothing were found large sums of gold. Her husband was also drowned, who also carried thousands of dollars, the weight of which perhaps aided in causing their deaths. One man had upon him an inflated life preserver, but beneath it was a belt of gold sufficiently heavy to weigh him down. Down to the bottom he went, even with the life preserver on. The people would not let their gold go, and they would perish. The following are the names of the lost, and as we go down the list of all the names and where they were from and how old they were, we see the name of David Churchill of Sycamore, DeKalb County, Illinois. He had on his person $299.25, aged about 50 years. They had noted that they buried the bodies where they found them on the beach. So the question becomes, is David there, or is he with his daughter and his wife at Ohio Grove Cemetery? We probably will never know. After I finished the article, I called the cemetery. I talked to the woman, a very elderly woman, and she said there's no way to determine if the coffin is there or not. They just have the names, and that's it. So with that, we close the story, the sad story of David Churchill and the Churchill family. Okay, now that we've told that part of the story about David Churchill and how he met his end, and by the way, not even sure if he's buried there at that grave. They had said, the bodies were buried on the shore. But I want to share with you also, and this is from the manuscript of Dr. Nelson, the expert of St. Charles, on how these grave robbers right there, how they did their job, what were their techniques. I was horrified to read some of this stuff. I had no idea. So I'm going to tell that story right now. And now I'm going to touch on some of the fine arts of grave robbing from the manuscript of Dr. Rodney Nelson. And he starts by saying the fine art of the grave robbing involved a technique of several stages. Detection of disturbance of a grave rarely occurred, and each step was meticulously followed. Now, the first step was to secure knowledge of the prospective burial, usually supplied by some former student of the medical college to the authorities of the institution. Now, the next step was to locate the grave accurately in the daylight hours so that you wouldn't have to search in the dark. You could get in and get out. And a common method to do that was kind of disguise yourself as a hunter. A stranger would appear in the neighborhood on the day of burial with a shotgun over his shoulder, apparently hunting small game. No problem. No one would really care. Casually strolling through the cemetery, hunting for the game, he would note the position of the open grave and its relation to the entrance of the cemetery and to some landmark observable in the dark, such as a large monument, which would allow him to find the grave quickly when he should return a few hours later. Now, what's interesting is they would use 3 men to handle the disinterment. 1 man must remain with the conveyance, that would be the cart, the horses with everything in it, and it was to be driven away to return at a specified time if the cemetery was located on a public highway. And again, in those days, highways were like the dirt paths, roads that people would use over and over. Because a conveyance standing in front of the cemetery at night would arouse suspicion of anyone who chanced to pass along the highway. Now, 2 of the able-bodied men were needed to make the disinterment itself. The entire surface of the grave was carefully examined with a shaded lantern on arrival. And a common practice was for some friend of the deceased to arrange on the closed grave a careful pattern of stones, shells, sticks, or flowers in order to detect disturbance. This pattern must be mapped out so that it could be restored exactly the way it was after the disinterment. The whole idea was not to let anybody know that the body was even taken. Now, they would use 2 large tarps, very necessary as part of the equipment. Why? Well, one was to spread beside the grave, and all the excavated soil would be thrown upon it, so that when the soil was returned to the grave, there would be no telltale bits left in the grass. Now, the first thing they would do is make the excavation, and they would make it approximately 3 feet square at the head end of the grave until a rough box was reached. The depth of the excavation was 4 feet or less, and that not over 35 cubic feet of soil needed to be handled. Because this dirt was already loose from the initial burial, excavation was not difficult, unless there were slabs of stones encountered. The head end of the rough box was removed by boring rows of holes with an auger. You couldn't use a saw, you couldn't use a hatchet, it would make too much noise. And then the removal of the cover of the frail coffin was a simple matter. And the next was to withdraw the body. And it was usually done with what was called a hook. Now get this. This was a strong iron bar about 5 feet in length. One end was turned up into a blunt hook of about 2 inches, while the other end was made like a cross handle, so 1 or 2 men can pull on it. And the hook end was placed under the chin of the body down there, and the 2 able-bodied men could draw the body from the coffin. It was almost like hooking a fish and hanging a fish. But the hook would seriously injure the structures of the floor and roof of the mouth. So later, as an alternative, they kind of switched to the use of a harness strapped under the arms of the body with a ring in the back to which a rope was tied. Now, once the body was brought out, it was laid down on the tarp. The shroud or other apparel was usually stripped off and thrown back in the grave. That would be the clothing. Now, the disposal of the apparel or clothing involved difficulty, and complete disposal was necessary because clothing, if found, and here's the key, made identification positive. If you have the clothing on the body, they could identify the person. Now, I don't know why they couldn't look at the face, but that's why they did it. Then the body was closely wrapped and tied and strapped in the tarpaulin. Failure to observe this step of the technique often resulted in something from the body, its apparel or ornaments being left near the grave. And if that was found, that would be giving positive evidence that the grave had been disturbed. That's the last thing you wanted. Now, the body having been wrapped, the excavated soil returned to the grave and the surface carefully restored to the exact condition Next, all the tools were counted and wrapped in the tarp also, upon which the soil had been thrown. And then the tarp would be securely tied as to no tool would drop out. Now, if you were caught, there's a good chance you would be shot, especially if it was the family members. So that's a wrap-up of the basic techniques of grave robbing back in the 1800s. And if you want to read more, you can go to the manuscript and read all about it. All right, gang, that's going to close it out for today. If we find any more information on the story, I'm going to create a part 4. I don't know if that's going to happen. We may just be leaving it at a trilogy, but stay tuned. We never know. We never know what Barb Churchill might find. I do know a story of another Marilla she told me about, Rockford, Illinois. Same thing happened. So maybe maybe that'll be a part 1 on another adventure we go on that turns into a trilogy. Who knows? But anyway, see you soon, and great to have you. Be safe.